Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first part of this two-part podcast episode brought to you by Catapult Healthcare. I'll be your host, Gabrielle, and today we are joined by Suzanne Raymond, who is National Recruiter with Catapult Healthcare, Shannon Kanakaole, Recruiting Operations Manager with Catapult Healthcare, and also Paul Shu, who is a registered nurse in the great state of Pennsylvania. Thank you so much all for joining us.
Thanks, Gabrielle.
Thank you. Absolutely.
Thank you.
So, Paul, could you go ahead and give us a little bit of background, what it is you do?
Sure. So I am a registered nurse in the state of Pennsylvania, as you said. I primarily come out of the ICU background, kind of a general medical ICU. And then I've had some experiences in other places, but not as in any great length of time. And currently with Catapult, in my current contract, I've worked for close to 9 months as a float pool nurse with ICU. So I mainly pulled to the ICU units that we have, but I also work in the med surge floors from time to time and a step down floor from time to time. And so I have flexibility across the hospital. And occasionally they'll pull me to the ER as well. And that's kind of my general background.
Oh, wow. So you're kept very busy.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well, Paul, this next question is for you. What are some of the things you look for when choosing a company to work with?
First, it's transparency. You can pick up right away if you've kind of been, whether you're new to contract nursing, an agency, working with agencies or not, you want to hope that you're looking for kind of transparency, which is reflective of how much the agency knows about the contract, and then connecting with that is how much information they're able to get from the entity or the facility that you would work for to try and help make the best informed decision.
Absolutely. So I'm sensing a theme here, transparency.
Yes, definitely. There's a lot of details that go into the work and the communication between the agency, the facility, the hospital, and the nurse that would be taking that contract before they get to orientation, get to hit the ground in that location, wherever that might be. So a lot of things need to happen with the nurse and the agency and the facility to make all those things happen in a timely fashion. Sometimes it's pretty quickly turnaround, and we need to have all the right paperwork in place, et cetera, that the facility is requiring.
Paul, what do you find are some of the top priorities in a travel agency? And what do you think, from your experience, what their priorities should be? Like, what should you be looking for?
I think you want to look for an agency that has experience with, one, just the whole industry as a whole. It moves at a really fast pace. Things are constantly changing. And I think you want an agency that is staying on top of information because things are constantly changing. And so being able to give that information to the nurse that's interested in working with that agency is paramount because being able to kind of trust that the people you're going to work with are doing their due diligence is going to make you feel more comfortable about working with that company.
Absolutely. So, Shannon, do you have anything to add here? What do you think are some of the top priorities that you should look for in a travel agency? And what do you think their priorities should be?
Yeah, well, I think Paul hit the nail on the head. Really, it starts with transparency, right? Oftentimes, when we're dealing with our nurses and from the initial call that we kind of do our introductions with them, we don't know who they are. We don't know where they live. We don't know if they have children. We don't know some of their top priorities, right? We don't know how they stack rank job opportunities that we may or may not have available, right? So the first and most important thing always from our level is to understand what are the external factors that go into them making a decision on where they need to be for their next contract or their next opportunity, whether it's a travel nurse assignment or if it's a permanent position that they're doing a huge career change. So that's where we start. That's the main priority for our recruiting side. It's always understanding, hey, what are the top 3 things that are most important to you? And then from there, it's working backwards, right? Then from there, it's understanding, all right, now that we've identified this opportunity, let's make sure that the position that we have available, or the positions that we have available, are a good fit for your skills and expertise. And Paul can elaborate on this, that, there are so many different, nuances, specialties, modalities in the healthcare industry as a whole, and it can get kind of complex. So just, I would say, there's some situations where we run across where, we have nurses with, let's say, a med surg background or an ICU background, but that doesn't necessarily qualify them for some of the more, I would say, specialized ICU positions, in which case, Paul's an exceptional ICU nurse that has a variety of backgrounds, a variety of experiences with all these different types of cases. But on the other hand, sometimes you have nurses that don't have as much experience, or don't have as much experience dealing with some of the cases and complexities that Paul is taking care of, right? And so really it's moving from what are the priorities of the nurse to what are the priorities of the hospital, right? And trying to connect the dots and pair the two together in a way that's seamless and also can offer a speed to market, right? Because the one thing that every person out there, whether you're in healthcare or you're just looking for a job, you don't want to go weeks without not knowing, hey, where am I going to land, right? When am I going to start, and when am I going to get that next paycheck?
Absolutely. And I like what you said, to just identify the top 3 things most important to you and then work backwards from there, because it kind of falls into place. All of those many different components kind of fall into place once you identify what it is that you want to make it a good fit, right? What is it? You identify what it is you want out of it. And, Suzanne, do you have anything to add? What are some of the top priorities in a travel agency, and what do you think their priorities should be?
Transparency is a great one. Obviously, being upfront about what's going on and having clear communication with your traveler is very important. But one of the things that I find a lot with the new travelers, the biggest complaint that I get is that even if there is transparency, there's not enough communication. So, I try to make a point to check in at least once a day with my travelers, just to make sure we're keeping up with the jobs that are going on. We're keeping up with, the rates and what hospitals to look for. If you're not checking in with your people as much as you need to, if you're not communicating enough, then that leads people to believe they don't have time for me, or maybe they're ghosting me, or something's happening behind the scenes that I don't know about, and then you lose a little bit of faith in your recruiter because they're not communicating with you as well. So transparency is a great thing to have, but if you're not communicating enough with people, then that's, no matter how transparent you are, that's still going to leave room for doubts in their mind for who their staffing company is and what they can really do for them.
That's an excellent point. You can't have one without the other. They work together, the transparency and communication, and that's how you create the most optimal flow with things. So thank you for that. And Paul, after a whirlwind past couple of years, what does the lay of the land look like in Pennsylvania post-COVID? What's going on?
Sure. As COVID's tapered off, it certainly has contracted the industry here. And so people are looking for new opportunities across the state of Pennsylvania and beyond. And people are even changing agencies to find those new opportunities. So nurses are really trying to figure out what their next steps are, and trying to stay in. A lot of them are trying to stay in the agency world. So that really it causes them to try and really do a lot of research and finding those opportunities that'll match up with their experience, what they're looking for financially, and then what geographically is going to be working for them.
Shannon, so, as a recruiting operations manager with Catapult, with COVID and just the whirlwind in the past couple of years, can you give us a better idea of what the lay of the land looks like?
Yeah, I would say as a whole, the whole landscape of healthcare agency travel nursing has changed completely, right? I started working at Catapult Healthcare in 2017, right? And then when we started our travel nurse piece in 2018, rates were rates were still great, right? We talk about, the financial motivation to getting into travel nursing, right? At the time, a lot of the nurses that made that leap of faith, were making anywhere between 1.5 to 2 times what their staff salary was, right? And then you get into COVID shortly after. 2 years into our travel nurse adventure, it changed drastically from a financial perspective, and a lot of the nurses were making anywhere between $6,000 to $10,000 a week, right? Obviously, that was supported by a lot of different federal funds, the government coming into play to kind of help offset some of that financial burden on hospitals. But in addition to that, right, what that created was a huge claim to fame, essentially, for travel nursing, where a lot of nurses, maybe in the past, from 2018 into the early part of 2020, never really thought about getting into travel nursing. It was in the back of their mind. But how could you say no to, a $6,000 or $10,000 paycheck every week, right? And so,
I would not.
Right. And so there was this large pool of candidates and large influx of nurses that were staff nurses that were wanting to make this leap of faith, right? Because I guess who wouldn't? And now we're seeing that market reset, right? Now we're out of COVID. We understand that, there's cutoffs, right? A lot of the hospitals aren't getting the financial support that they did have in the past. They're also not seeing the same levels or census levels of patients coming into the hospitals, right? So all these things are compounding all at once. And, us agencies kind of being in the middle of that change, not only between the hospital as well as the providers, right? And trying to keep everybody tied together. It's been complicated, right? It's been a complicated and frustrating process. A lot of the nurses look towards their agencies, to confide in them, to truly understand. Paul said transparency, right? Hey, what's going on in the market? These rates are fluctuating. They're going up one day, they're going down the next day. Now we're seeing that it's more trending downwards, right? These rates are trending downwards. And, to have transparency as an agency is key when it comes to these financial decisions that, a nurse will ultimately have to make, whether it's looking at new contracts or the contract that they're on. And we're seeing this trend across the board. It's not just Pennsylvania. We're seeing it in pretty much in every state, right? Everything's kind of resetting. A lot of I guess what we call it internally here is like a market readjustment, is what we're calling. But to Paul's point, it's not going to be the same, right? This is a new normal. There's that new COVID, right? The COVID protocols that will always exist, the COVID type of care that will always exist. And with that, the type of nurse that has to be, has to bring that type of experience into those situations. That's never going to change. That's never going to go away. But from a travel agency perspective, we're kind of in the middle of all this heat and all this commotion. And we're just trying to weather this storm. And we're crossing our fingers and praying that, in the next couple of months or so, things will kind of stabilize and we won't see these fluctuations as often. But yeah, that's, it's been a crazy ride. And, the market as a whole is just, it's been up and down.
Suzanne, as a national recruiter with Catapult, could you give us a little bit of insights into what Pennsylvania looks like right now with post-COVID?
Yeah, I'm kind of in a unique situation where I started recruiting last year in the height of COVID. So where a lot of new travel nurses came in, not knowing what to expect, and this being their first time normal, I kind of had the same experience as well. So, in the past, Pennsylvania, especially being a single state, so not as many people could go in, I could just call up anyone and be like, hey, I've got this great contract that's making great money. They're looking for someone in the next hour to apply and go on the ground. And we would get a submission in. Next day, we'd get an offer, and we're good to go. They're making great money. Now, where our market is correcting. It's going back to pre-COVID. Not quite what pre-COVID rates used to be, still a little bit higher, but also not making, as Shannon said, $6,000 to $10,000 a week. It's more of a, hey, calling you up because this might be a location that you're looking for, or hey, this is a local contract for you. Hey, looks like you worked for this hospital in the past. Do you maybe have people that you want to go back to work with as a contractor instead of working staff 2 years ago? And it's kind of this weird education moment for people who haven't done this before, because I'm trying to talk to them and let them know, like, this is kind of what we were seeing in the past. Here's the real expectation to have now. But it's kind of odd to have that conversation because I was never there in the past to really experience what travel nursing was before COVID. So a bit of an interesting learning opportunity for both me and the people that I work with. But I can definitely say that people are not traveling, just because they're seeing the best contract out in the world anymore. They're really focusing on, do I have family in the area? They're focusing on, is this a place that needs the help because it's, really low in staffing? Is it a critical access hospital where maybe there's not as much access to healthcare as there is to other places like Philadelphia or Pittsburgh is? So just the way that we approach things is definitely a lot more different than it used to be, which I personally do enjoy just because I feel like I'm looking for things that people are wanting more than I was in the last year or two.
Absolutely. Well, Paul, what are some of the steps to be taken after you start working with a travel agency, or are there any?
Sure. You want to come into the table as the nurse. You want to make sure you have all your records up to date. You have your paperwork in order. There are times that sometimes paperwork needs to be resent. The hospital has a request. Usually those need to be met pretty quickly to ensure that your timeline stays intact with your contract and your start date. So that's kind of first and foremost. When you're getting started, you're going to have to submit a lot of paperwork, your credentialing and certifications you have, and your medical record with your vaccinations and shots. And so having that is sort of a given for the industry, but you need to make sure you have it all together so you can submit it in a timely fashion. When you're getting on the ground at the facility, you need to make sure that you have an open mind and that you're flexible. Some things are not always as fluid or kind of clear and organized when you get there. As far as orientation goes, things might change pretty quickly. And so you just need to understand, like, if you've already started, you've accepted the contract, you're at site, you have to just be understanding that things can change, but they're going to get you where you need to go. And make sure that you're communicating with your recruiter if things just don't seem to be adding up with what the contract agreement was. If all of a sudden you're being pulled somewhere where you don't feel comfortable or wasn't a part of your contract, make sure that you clarify that with your recruiter to make sure everybody is on the same page. You hate to get into a week or 2 weeks and be like, hey, this is not what we agreed upon, or this is not what I understood to be my contractual commitment. You really don't want to let things get away from you in terms of time.
Absolutely. And I bet Suzanne will agree that, she's might be very grateful that you do all those things, right? You get organized, you get all the details up front, that transparency and communication, because it just makes it that just much more streamlined.
Oh, yeah. It's streamlined for you and for us. I'm a little bit of a hypocrite. I definitely don't keep my medical records as much as my father would like me to. But I always tell nurses, nurses and allied health and anyone, just keep everything that you have, all of your medical records, any, past screenings that you've done, mask fits, physicals, everything. The more you have ready to go after you get an offer, the quicker we can get everything done. Because the last thing we want is to have a date pushed back just because, maybe you took a little bit longer to go get a drug testing done, or you took a little bit longer to get your TB done, because those things take time. It's not like you walk into the facility or a clinic and then they're handed to you same day. They take a few days to process, and so the faster that you can get things done, the quicker we can get things moving for you, and it's just a much simpler process for everybody.
Absolutely, it is a much simpler process for everybody, and then you can get to doing what you do best. All right. Well, that concludes the first part of our discussion regarding how to choose an agency to work with as a registered nurse. So just thank you all for joining us, and please make sure you tune in for part 2 as we continue our discussion and learn some more insights.